Hi folks, still here at Elings Park, and remember this is a place where you can go paragliding among other things. And I wanted to talk about that documentary that we watched this week, Climate Migration, and the topic of climate migration. So first, many people, when they think of the consequences of the climate crisis, they think of things like sea level rise. And even so, they think of it in pretty moderate level. But that can be significant in its own right, just as what it is. So Kim Stanley Robinson, of course, suggested that if we had a couple meters of sea level rise, which is, possible this century, that pretty much you can forget about all the beaches of California. All of California's iconic beaches would be covered. And if you think about it, 6 feet of water, like the highest tide that you can imagine, that would be the case. That's not the biggest problem there, however, insofar as storm surge can be much higher, and we've seen storm surge in the Caribbean and other places because of a very high intensity hurricanes. Some hurricanes that would technically be considered Category 6 that we've had in the last few years, if the categories went up that high, where you have 20 or 30 feet of storm surge coming in. Although there's an airplane above me, I'm not sure if you can hear it. That's an issue, and of course we think of the other physical things that happen with climate change, things like drought and wildfires and all. But it's the cultural things that we often forget that are going to be supremely significant. An example would be climate migration. So this film is a good one, but it is over a dozen years old now. And it's surprising you have sort of bipartisan support for acting on it. You have people like Newt Gingrich, who's was a very conservative Speaker of the House in the 1990s. There isn't really the quite bipartisan support for action now. And it's also the case that there's been an awful lot that has happened with climate migration, including in the United States, or that's impacting the United States, and this will have profound, larger consequences. So what do I mean by that? Well, people often talk about the area in Central America that often will include Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador as becoming what's now known as the dry corridor. So what's that about? Well, because in part of climate change, we've had a lot of drought in California in the teens, but it arguably was even worse in places in Central America. What that meant is that people there who made their living, as did many people from farming, in some cases subsistence farming, they had a problem, a big problem. What's more, they were hit in that area with a couple major hurricanes during the end of the teens. In one case, it literally wiped out 80% of the agricultural production in Honduras. What that's meant for people living there is that, especially for those who are farmers, it's just no longer possible to live the way they may have lived there for many generations. And, with nothing there to hold them, they've felt the need to move, to migrate to some place where the climate is more, beneficial. If you look at the statistics of the people who are entering the U.S. from our southern border, you'll find that if you go back to about the time when the film Climate Migration was made, about above 80%, mid 80% of the people coming into the U.S. from our southern border were coming from Mexico. Flash forward a decade later, if you look now or even a couple years ago, over 80%, like 85% or more, are coming from Central America, places like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Why? In part because the climate crisis is impacting it there, forcing them to become climate migrants. That's really unfortunate. But think about the great, cultural, political consequences of that. If you ask people, and polls have been done on this. Pew did a poll like this a few years ago. If you ask people who self-identify as conservative and are a little older than me, the number one problem that they see in the country today, number one, is what they call the crisis at the border. Immigration, people coming to the United States from other parts of the world, our southern border. However, the really fascinating thing to think about this is the climate crisis is playing a major role in that. The ascendancy of very conservative political candidates, Donald Trump would be an example, who use this to their advantage, make a big deal about this situation at the border and the idea of closing our borders. And if something's happening environmentally, a consequence of the climate crisis, they're very quick to close the border. So when Bahamas was pretty much devastated by a major hurricane, people there asked if they could come into the United States because, they really, it's not that just their houses and lives were destroyed. I mean, they really needed basic services like, food and medical services and all. And of course, Donald Trump very famously denied them access. So it raises this question of what is going to happen when there are not just a few million people on the move, but as will happen, people are predicting throughout this century, hundreds of millions of people will be on the move because of the climate migration. You can see this happening in the United States, and you can see how it helped inaugurate a very bipartisan, this tribal political era where we, have become very nationalist, want to close our borders, want to actually build a big wall to stop people coming in. The irony, of course, is that the climate crisis, more than any other country on the planet, the United States contributed more greenhouse gases than anyone else, 25%. So we caused this problem. If you look at the, percentage of greenhouse gases emitted by the people in like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, I forget the number, but I think it's actually 1% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So these folks did very little, practically nothing to cause the climate crisis, and yet they are suffering for it. And when they look for help, to their northern neighbor, the people who did more to cause the crisis than anyone else, they get a very harsh, reproach, and it's pretty horrible. So to think about this then, yes, we're going to have sea level rise. Yes, we're going to lose our beaches. Yes, we're going to have storm surges that will do things like during Superstorm Sandy, inundate part of the island of Manhattan, major part of New York City, flooding the subways and all. But we're also going to have major cultural problems because of it, political problems. Those political problems will impact politics, impact the political complexion of the United States, where, we have this, ongoing desire to become more nationalist and close our borders. So I just want your opinion on all this. First on the documentary and anything in the documentary that you found interesting, but do keep in mind that it's a good documentary, but it's a little dated now. But now, in the last decade, in the teens, we're seeing so much more of this, and I'm just curious what you think about it, and what it makes you think about the climate crisis. In other words, if you stop thinking of it as just a physical thing like sea level rise. Okay, I probably went a little too long. So that's it for today, and I hope you come here to enjoy Ealing's Park at some point. Okay, take care.